You smell it before you see it. A hint of smoke riding on the warm salt breeze from the sea. You think it might be distant. You think it might go away. You are wrong. This was not a casual morning, not an ordinary day. It is 48 BCE, the same year that the Roman Republic, already on its knees, fractured under its own ambition. The Romans marked their years from the founding of Rome, ab urbe condita, from the city having been built, and in that reckoning, this is 706 AUC. But here, in Egypt, we mark time by the rising and flooding of the Nile, by the cycles of gods and harvests, by offerings and prayers, different calendars, same world. You had been at the temple of Serapis this morning, not out of fear, not out of devotion to doctrine, but out of desire for meaning. Serapis was a god born of syncretism, a deity created to unify Greek and Egyptian worship in Alexandria's cosmopolitan streets. Half Egyptian, half Greek in spirit, wholly embraced by a city that held 100 tongues in its heart. You lit incense, cedar and lotus, and closed your eyes, breathing the quiet that seemed so distant from what the day would become. You walked away from that sanctuary lighter in spirit than you should have felt, carrying only a small amphora of wine, crisp, sweet, from a vendor whose cheerful eye suggested you were not the first thoughtful soul to pass his stall. Then the smoke. At first a wisp against blue sky, a question, a warning. Then cries, then chaos. You didn't know why at first. You only saw people running, not away from danger, but toward it. The harbor was burning. You learned it wasn't random. Roman ships had been set alight in the siege of Alexandria, part of Julius Caesar's strategy to control the city's naval approach. But fire, once freed, pays no loyalty to strategy. It leapt like flame always does, from timber to dock, from dock to warehouse, from warehouse to scroll. And there, where the world's knowledge was kept, the fire found its greatest feast. The great Library of Alexandria, not just a building, but a repository of what humanity had learned. Astronomy, medicine, mathematics, poetry, philosophy, law, history, the thoughts of countless minds from across continents and ages, pagans and sages, farmers and thinkers, names we know and names forgotten, all gathered, preserved, intertwined. Scrolls curled, ink blistered and ran like blood, pages crackled like bones, and you stood just outside the courtyard, watching the sky turn orange and ash fall like snow in a summer storm. You weren't a soldier, not a priest, not a philosopher tasked with saving truth. You were just someone who remembered what the library meant. And now you have a choice. You could run in. You could try to pull something, anything, from the shelves. You could open scrolls charred at the edges and rewrite from memory what you once saw. Or you could turn away. Because fire is not just destruction. Fire is erasure. And if no one remembers what was lost, then for all future peoples, it never really existed. This was not the end of knowledge, not yet, but it was the beginning of forgetting. Not out of hatred, not out of fervor, but out of the carelessness of those in power and the apathy of those who stood by. That day memory was breached, and you understood with sudden clarity that history is not merely recorded, it is defended. And that defense is not only the work of kings or scholars, it is the work of anyone who remembers. Centuries before the word history had been spoken as it is today, the first great flame licked the margins of the known world. The scrolls burned, the ink cracked, the memory smoldered. But someone, somewhere, wrote it down. Today is not the fire of parchment and papyrus, not the blaze that devoured scrolls in the shadow of Caesar's ships. No, this fire burns colder, bureaucratic, algorithmic. It spreads through silence, through redefinition, through the willful erosion of memory. It is not announced by smoke. It does not crackle through libraries. It hums through fiber optics, whispers in boardrooms, and reshapes language until tyranny becomes a slogan and truth becomes treason. And so we arrive at a question not posed by any one person, but demanded by the moment itself. What do we call this? Some avoid the answer, others hedge. They say fascism is a strong word, or we should be cautious with our definitions. But caution unchecked becomes complicity, and clarity deferred becomes permission. So let us be clear. The word fascism has many academic definitions, some stricter than others. Some scholars require an overtly totalizing vision of the state. Others emphasize militarism, the myth of national rebirth, the centrality of violence, or the scapegoating of minorities and dissidents. But definitions are not rituals, they are tools, and they must be applied. Let us apply them. Does fascism require the fusion of state and corporate power? What then, when leaders invest in companies whose fates they shape through policy? When media conglomerates serve power rather than scrutinize it? Does fascism demand the suppression of opposition? What then? When journalists are vilified, protesters surveilled, and dissenters painted as traitors? Does fascism require a mythic past and a national rebirth? What then when a nation is told to be great again, not by advancing justice, but by reclaiming a nostalgic hallucination built on conquest and exclusion? Some say fascism needs a single party, a uniform, a dictator. But Mussolini's Italy did not begin with black shirts in every street. It began with normalization, with media excuses, with elites who thought they could control him until they couldn't. So we must ask not just, is this fascism, but how close must the fire be before we are allowed to name the smoke? Because if history teaches anything, it is this. Authoritarianism does not always announce itself with jackboots. Sometimes it arrives in a tailored suit with a flag behind it and a crowd chanting its name. And if we are forbidden to speak its name until the burning begins, then what exactly is memory for? To name a thing is to resist its erasure. To speak truth in the moment before the fire is not hysteria. It is history, fulfilled in reverse. And so we name this not for effect, not for dramatics, but because if we cannot name fascism while it is forming, we will only name it later, from exile, from prison, or from memory, if we survive long enough to remember. History does not always shout. Sometimes it simply forgets to warn us. Between each great blaze, between the library and the Reichstag, between Sarajevo and Kiev, there is a silence, a lull mistaken for peace, a slow corrosion mistaken for civility. We are living in that silence now. The world once built institutions to guard against this erosion. The United Nations was born in the ashes of World War, not as a perfect bulwark, but as a promise that sovereignty, peace, and human rights would not again be consumed by the fires of conquest and hate. But even the strongest architecture decays when termites are welcomed in. And now, a figure stands who would see those promises undone. Not with bombs, not yet, but with words, with alliances shattered, with power centralized under grievance and gold. His name is not the point, his tactics are, his trajectory familiar. Some ask, is he a fascist? They ask it the way a doctor asks if the shadow on the scan might be cancer, quietly, hesitantly, as though naming it might summon it. But the symptoms are there. The fusion of state and corporate power, visible in energy markets, tilted toward donors and media conglomerates pressured or praised based on loyalty, not law. Even investments in Netflix and Warner Brothers bonds raise questions when the same voices steer regulatory decisions affecting them. The suppression of dissent, not yet gulags, but subpoenas and smear campaigns, DOJ interventions, and whispers of the Insurrection Act, governors subpoenaed, judges intimidated, and protesters monitored through state surveillance. The promise of a golden past, stolen by enemies within, to be restored by the strong hand of one man alone. Utopian, perhaps, but only for him. The dehumanization of immigrants, the vilification of the press, the embrace of autocrats abroad, and the assault on elections at home. Votes gerrymandered, access restricted, and outcomes preemptively delegitimized in the court of public opinion. And still, many hedge. They say we must be precise, as if precision were more important than prevention, as if the fire needs a name before it burns the house. Some say he lacks a totalizing ideology, but what if personal loyalty as policy is not the elevation of self above law, a creed of its own? Others say fascism needs uniforms and salutes, but what if memes and militias? What if algorithmic propaganda and private surveillance contracts? The muskets are gone, but the violence is not. This moment demands something more. Not panic, not prophecy, but clarity and courage. If we wait for a final signal, we will have waited too long. The fire does not begin with the match. It begins with the silence that lets the match be struck. And in that silence, each of us must choose to whisper or to witness, to excuse or to expose, to wait or to write it down. Because once the fire comes, it will be too late to debate its temperature. We do not speak to predict. We speak so the record remains. So someone somewhere might one day say, "They saw it coming, and they did not lie." Fascism rarely introduces itself with a straight back and a raised flag. It comes first with a question, then with a silence. Is it really fascism? They ask, half curious, half afraid, as if naming it might conjure it, as if defining it too clearly might demand a response. The scholars quibble. The definitions multiply. Some say it must be totalitarian. Others demand an official ideology, a corporatist state, a paramilitary arm, a cult of tradition. The checkboxes grow longer, and yet the fire is already licking at the baseboards. And here we must pause, not for more authority, but for reason. If I ask you what 1 + 1 equals, you do not consult a panel. You do not defer to scholars. You do not wait for consensus. You answer 2, because logic does not require permission. At some point, evidence accumulates, patterns repeat, conclusions follow, and refusing to name them is no longer rigor, it is evasion. When power centralizes, when dissent is punished, when elections are delegitimized, when loyalty replaces law, when truth is subordinated to grievance, we are not guessing, we are reasoning. To pretend otherwise is not caution, it is abdication. So let us name the smoke. There is authoritarianism, a hunger for unchecked power. We see that. There is ultranationalism, the belief that one country, one race, one culture must dominate. We hear that. There is contempt for dissent, the press as enemies, the protester as traitor. That too. There is myth-making, stolen elections, golden pasts, enemies at the gate. And there is a leader, not a servant of law, but the embodiment of the nation, who alone can fix it. If these are not the signs of fascism, then the word has no meaning left. Some say, but he has no coherent ideology, as if self-worship is not an ideology, as if vengeance is not a vision, but self-interest as governance, profit as policy, and vengeance as moral compass. Is that not a doctrine all its own? Some say, but he has not fully succeeded, as if a fire must engulf the city before we admit its burning. Others say, but he's not Hitler. No, he is not. But does it require another Hitler before we act? Or does the lesson of history demand we learn from the first spark, not the final ash? The scholars in their caution forget. Fascism evolves with its tools. Its masks change, from propaganda posters to algorithmic timelines, from torchlit rallies to primetime rants. The truth is this. Fascism is not a singular shape. It is a pattern of decay, a surrender to power dressed as patriotism, a willingness to trade law for order, conscience for comfort, and truth for loyalty. It rarely arrives wearing jackboots. More often, it comes in a suit behind a podium, with a promise to restore greatness and punish the enemies of the state. And when the press hedges, when the professors demur, when the people say, not yet, it grows bolder. It does not need all the boxes checked. It only needs silence. So the question is not whether he is fascist enough. The question is whether we are free enough to name it, and brave enough to resist it. For if we wait until the uniforms match the photos in our textbooks, it will be too late. It already nearly is. By now, the pattern should be clear. The fire doesn't just consume truth, it distorts vision. It fills the air with enough smoke that people begin to doubt what they see, or wish not to see at all. A president strips oversight, pardons allies, and suggests running for an illegal third term. The military is floated as a domestic police force. Protesters are brutalized, journalists assaulted, election officials threatened, courts flooded, and yet many say it's just politics. But if history teaches anything, it is this: authoritarianism never arrives all at once. It advances in stages, testing boundaries, exploiting chaos, and normalizing each new abuse, until what once seemed unthinkable becomes routine. It spreads through institutions, and also through inaction. It doesn't need a flag, only silence. And now the United States looks abroad with imperial eyes once more. Greenland, sovereign and self-governed under Denmark, becomes a target not of diplomacy, but desire, not of partnership, but possession. Why? Because the ice is melting, because beneath it lie untapped resources, because a warming Arctic invites a new frontier of control. An empire always hungers for new frontiers. But if America seizes Greenland by force, it will fracture the alliance meant to protect peace. NATO. A war on one is a war on all, unless one of the allies becomes the aggressor. Then what? Does Europe call its bluff? Does it resist? Or does it watch as the world redraws itself again, not by dialogue, but by conquest? This is how fires leap oceans. A president flouts law at home, then power abroad. He kidnaps a foreign head of state. He floats annexation. He speaks of retribution. He installs loyalists. He mocks dissent. And the press wonders if it's another cycle. But the cycle is the strategy. To overwhelm, to exhaust, to demoralize, until even naming the fire feels like lighting a match. Meanwhile, institutions stall, courts hesitate, Congress blinks, allies fumble statements. The United Nations, created in the ashes of fascism, stands largely impotent, its Security Council shackled by vetoes and outdated hierarchies. Fusion of state and corporate power, once thought laughable, now materializes in plain sight. Energy companies thrive on deregulation, while their executives sit at the policy table. A president's circle buys into media giants, even as they oversee regulatory approvals for mergers. The same hand signs the check in the law. Historical narratives are rewritten in museums and school boards. Truth is curated, softened, or banned altogether. The fire doesn't just burn books, it revises their contents while they're still on the shelf. The surveillance state watches. The militarization of domestic law enforcement expands. The Insurrection Act hangs like a threat, never far from invocation. Elections are delegitimized, votes suppressed, districts carved for control. Every institution bent not to serve the people, but to preserve power. This is the smoke we now breathe. And it stings the eyes not just because it burns, but because it clouds what we once saw clearly. The Constitution, the rule of law, international norms, they are not self-sustaining. They require belief, and belief requires clarity. But when every warning is politicized, when every truth is disputed, when every protest is punished, when every act of aggression is spun as defense, the fire spreads not because it is strong, but because too few are willing to speak plainly. This is not normal. This is not safe. This is not sustainable. And yet it is happening. The smoke of it reaches even the quiet corners of the world. Streets in Tirana, in Warsaw, in Reykjavik, in Paris, they begin to feel uncertain, as if a shift has occurred beneath the skin of civilization itself. The choice is no longer between left and right, conservative and liberal. The choice is between those who believe in power through fear, and those who believe in power through consent, between silence and courage, between decay and duty. We are no longer in the age of muskets. We are in an era of digital prisons and algorithmic control. Protest may be legal, but it is surveilled. Resistance may be righteous, but it is isolated. And so what power do we have? Only this: to speak, to record, to tell the truth while it is still safe to do so, and even after it is not. The fire does not ask for your politics. It only asks, will you look away, or will you speak before the smoke blinds us all? Across centuries and continents, the fire that consumed Alexandria finds echoes in quieter blazes, those not made of flame, but of fear, distortion, and silence. Today, the great scrolls are digital, the libraries encoded in silicon and fiber, scattered across continents and stored in invisible clouds. And yet, their fragility is no less real. Knowledge can be lost not only through burning, but through willful erasure, by algorithm, by censorship, by the drowning flood of misinformation that numbs the mind into forgetting what truth even looks like. This is not hypothetical. In the modern era, we have seen power coalesce not just in capitals, but in corporations, in networks, in systems so complex that accountability dissipates like smoke. And in that fog, authoritarianism has returned, wearing the well-pressed suit of nationalism, waving familiar banners, speaking the language of resentment and restored greatness. We were told fascism could never return, that the world had learned its lesson, but history does not disappear, it waits. And now we face the unnerving reality that in the world's most powerful democracy, a man who incited an insurrection, praised dictators, undermined elections, and seeks to suppress dissent may once again ascend, not in secret, but in full view. Some call him a populist, some a conservative, others remain silent out of fear or strategic convenience. But a deeper question remains. What do we call a movement that erodes the rule of law, fuses state and corporate power, demonizes the press, and idolizes a single leader above all institutions? This is not just a debate of terms, it is a test of our moral clarity. If we cannot name tyranny when it marches in daylight, will we only recognize it when the boots echo through our streets? The scholars hesitate, the pundits hedge, the public is confused, some distracted, others overwhelmed. But here we must be clear. To seek power without constraint, to view opposition as treason, to weaponize the state for personal revenge, these are not the features of a democracy. These are the traits of authoritarianism, and if pursued to their end, they bear the markings of fascism. Does Trump fit every historic definition exactly? No, nor did many before him until it was too late. Fascism is not a checklist, it is a pattern, a set of tactics, a lust for control, and a disdain for shared truth. And even now we see the pattern. The promise of national rebirth through the elimination of enemies. The merging of state interests with corporate profit and loyalty. The erosion of norms, cloaked in the language of security. The suppression of independent institutions, courts, educators, and the press. Some say, but he hasn't done it yet. To which we must answer, he has tried, he is trying, and he will again, if unopposed. When history judges, it does not ask only what was done, it asks what was attempted and what was allowed. That is where we are now, in the moment before the fire consumes more than just words. The library is not yet gone, but the shelves are cracking, the guardians are wavering, and the air grows hotter with every lie left unchallenged. And while some still wait for the jackboot or the flag, they forget. We are no longer in the age of muskets. We are in the age of AK-47s, drones, stealth bombers, facial recognition, and ubiquitous surveillance. Rebellion is no longer a line of soldiers wearing tricorn hats. It is a single citizen holding a phone or a voice whispering truth on a digital scroll. Trump has already begun rewriting history. He has threatened educators, censored libraries, taken control of museums and narratives, deciding what may and may not be taught. He reimagines the past to bend the present. We face voter suppression, gerrymandering, and the deliberate erosion of trust in democratic institutions. When election outcomes are no longer believed, and when law enforcement turns its gaze not on violence but on protesters against it, what remains? Only this, the moral act of truth-telling. We who speak are not immune. We are not safe. The fire may consume us too, but the cost of silence is greater. It is the cost of our conscience, of our dignity, of our soul. This is not a call for hysteria. It is a call for historical awareness and moral resolve. Let us now speak plainly. The greatest danger is not only the man, but the machinery that sustains him, the donors who enable, the media that normalizes, the citizens who compartmentalize their conscience in exchange for comfort. If the fire comes, it will come through us, through our forgetting, our rationalizing, our failure to run toward the library when the smoke first appeared. But we can still act. We can speak. We can record. We can name what is happening, even if it costs us everything but our souls. Because the fire does not wait for consensus. It consumes what is not protected. History often records tyrants not by their rise, but by how few stood in their way. The machinery of democracy was built on paper, constitutions, charters, declarations. But paper, no matter how sacred, cannot defend itself from fire. And when the spark comes, it is not the flame that surprises us, but the silence before it. In America and across Europe, institutions once thought immutable now stutter in place. Congress debates procedure while the pillars shift. Courts hedge, agencies delay. And all the while, the very laws they're meant to uphold bend beneath political pressure. Power doesn't need to roar. It advances in increments. A judicial appointment here, a policy change there, a norm discarded, a precedent ignored. What was once unthinkable becomes tolerated, then expected, then demanded. This is how the silence of power works. A former president, twice impeached, reclaimed the throne. His prior term ended not with honor, but with bloodshed, his followers storming the Capitol in a desperate, violent bid to overturn an election. And yet, instead of disqualification, he gains momentum. Why? Because every institution is waiting for someone else to act. The courts wait on Congress, Congress waits on the voters increasingly gerrymandered and disenfranchised, wait on the courts, and the executive branch, it waits for the next election, as if elections are still sacred and safe. But elections too have become theater. Suppress the vote, overturn the result, call the opposition illegitimate, declare the media the enemy of the people, weaponize the courts, purge the agencies, label dissent as treason. Each step follows the same path carved by fascists before, and those who call it what it is, they're labeled alarmist, partisan, dramatic. But to remain silent is worse. Here is the question we must ask, honestly, without romance or illusion. Given the realities of modern power, what meaningful force do citizens actually possess? We are no longer in the age of muskets and pamphlets. We are in the age of drones, biometric surveillance, predictive policing, algorithmic censorship, and financial retaliation. The state no longer needs to imprison millions when it can isolate, exhaust, and economically erase individuals one by one. Europe is not free to act decisively against American hegemony, not without shattering its own economic and security foundations. NATO cannot meaningfully restrain its largest member if that member decides the rules no longer apply. Smaller democracies watch, calculate, and hesitate, not from cowardice, but from survival. And so the question sharpens. If armies are unreachable, institutions compromised, elections destabilized, and alliances constrained, what remains? Let this be said clearly, without ambiguity or surrender. This is not an argument against voting. It is not an argument against protest, strikes, marches, organizing, whistleblowing, or collective pressure. It is not an argument for withdrawal, apathy, or despair. All channels must be used. Every lawful tool must be exercised. Every form of civic pressure must be applied, locally, nationally, and globally. But it is a realistic assessment of the terrain. It is an acknowledgement that many of the levers once available have been weakened, captured, or insulated from accountability, and that pretending otherwise is not optimism, but self-deception. Democracy is not just a system, it is a shared act of belief. Once that belief is broken, no law, no vote, no institution can restore it alone. What remains is not power in the traditional sense. What remains is testimony. The act of speaking while it is still dangerous. The act of recording while erasure is underway. The refusal to let silence rewrite memory. This does not replace action. It sustains it. Because movements that outlast repression are built not only on resistance, but on record, on truth preserved when victory is uncertain. This is not safe work. It never was. Those who speak now may lose careers, community, protection, even freedom. But the cost of silence is greater still. It is the cost of conscience. It is the cost of dignity. It is the cost of leaving nothing behind but compliance. This is the moment before the fire, not when the match is lit, but when the guards look away, believing the walls will hold. But they won't. Not unless we speak. Not unless we write. Not unless we remember that silence, too, is a choice. And history has judged that choice before. So the fire returns, not in papyrus and torch, but in memory, law, and silence. It returns through screens, in slogans, in erasures. It returns in the voice that says, "It can't happen here." It returns when justice is delayed, when memory is blurred, and when names are forgotten to history, or worse, remembered only through the lens of those who outlived them by force. But this fire wears a suit now. This fire holds rallies. This fire shakes hands and grins for cameras, and calls itself a patriot. It rewrites libraries not with flames but with funding. It purges truths not with blades but with bans. It appoints judges. It breaks systems slowly until systems forget what they were built to protect. It moves quietly at first, always quietly at first, with plausible deniability and just enough distraction to divide those who might otherwise speak. And when it is met with protest, it does not respond with shame. It responds with punishment. Not always with prison, not always with violence, but with surveillance, with audits, with lawsuits, with smear campaigns, with economic suffocation, with the quiet removal of protection, with the turning of neighbors into informants, with the slow, grinding message, "This will cost you." Ask the librarians in states who now fear removing banned books, not just from shelves, but from their own memories. Ask the teachers unsure what they're allowed to say about history, race, gender, or genocide, not because the truth has changed, but because power has changed the cost of telling it. Ask the whistleblowers, hunted not for lying, but for revealing. Ask the refugees, who know that the fire always starts with language before it reaches the body. Ask the artists and thinkers and quiet rebels who no longer know if their work is safe or surveilled or simply waiting to be used against them later. And understand this clearly. The fire is not only external. It does not just burn buildings or laws. It burns livelihoods, reputations, families, futures. To speak now is to risk being marked, to be labeled unpatriotic, dangerous, disloyal, to lose work, community, protection. To be told, explicitly or not, that silence would have been easier. This is why so many hesitate. This is why fear works. Ask yourself, when does silence become complicity? And when does speaking become the last act of freedom? The fire does not announce itself with ash anymore. Now it comes as normalization, as fatigue, as endless compromise. It says, be practical. It says, be patient. It says, don't overreact. But the fire is not patient. The fire does not wait. It consumes in the time it takes for good people to become exhausted, and it feeds on the hesitation of those who mean well but fear too much. Not because they are weak, but because they understand the cost. This is not only an American story. This is not only Europe's problem. American citizens and NATO allies now occupy the same narrowing space, constrained by power they did not choose, bound to systems they can no longer fully steer. Europe hesitates not from cowardice, but from dependence. Like much of the world, some resist, others appease, others collaborate. Others wait. Many calculate, not from cowardice, but from uncertainty and interdependence. Americans resist not from apathy, but from exposure. Different shores, same rising heat. We are not in the Library of Alexandria. We are not standing before scrolls, wondering which to save. But we are standing before a moral archive, the lived record of our time. We are holding pens, microphones, cameras, keyboards, and voices. And we are deciding, whether we like it or not, what will be preserved and what will be lost. What truths will remain lit, and which will be left to smolder beneath censorship, retaliation, violence, and state-sanctioned forgetting. This is not a metaphor. This is the fire, and it is here. And yes, running toward it may burn us, but turning away guarantees something worse. A future that remembers only what the fire allowed to survive. What we choose now, what we protect, what we write, what we speak, will shape what survives. The fire, once acknowledged, cannot be unseen. Its flicker stains every silence, every headline too delicately phrased, every careful omission that cloaks danger in neutrality. And now, here, standing in its glow, we must ask, what do we remember, and why? History is not a ledger. It is a battleground. It is not kept by time. It is shaped by those who survive long enough to speak. And memory, like democracy, can be manipulated, distorted, repackaged by the victor, forgotten by the tired. So, when we speak of fascism, not as a distant past, but a living threat, we are not playing with words. We are choosing whether to remember honestly or comfortably. Let us recall what we've already explored. And let us also be clear about this. We may be wrong. History does not grant certainty in advance. No generation is handed a label stamped, "This is the moment." We work with incomplete information, distorted signals, and the bias of living inside the story we are trying to understand. But fallibility does not absolve responsibility. To admit uncertainty is not to abandon judgment. It is to make judgment more honest. We do not claim infallibility. We claim good faith, reasoning based on observable patterns, historical precedent, and the refusal to pretend we see nothing while the structure burns. We asked whether Trump is a fascist. Some say no, that he lacks ideology, coherence, a unifying utopian vision. But these objections fall apart under scrutiny. He does have a vision, himself at the center, immune from consequence, elevated by grievance and power. That is an ideology, even if its only creed is, "I alone can fix it." He does seek fusion of state and corporate power, not through formal declaration, but through practice, offering economic power in exchange for loyalty, punishing dissent through market threats, influencing private platforms through public coercion. He does demonize opponents and suppress dissent. His targets vary: immigrants, minorities, journalists, academics, prosecutors, peaceful protesters, but the pattern is consistent: dehumanize, delegitimize, neutralize, and he doesn't need brown shirts to succeed. In the digital age, the mob is ambient. The pressure comes not from organized boots, but from dispersed threats, doxing, economic retaliation, and coordinated lies that ruin lives by algorithmic proxy. We asked what recourse remains if NATO is weakened, if institutions are captured, if courts are compromised, if elections are undermined not just by fraud, but by gerrymandering, suppression, and fear. What power does the average citizen hold? And here, clarity matters. This is not an argument against voting, not an argument against protest, organizing, striking, marching, or collective pressure, not an argument against civic engagement, international solidarity, or political action at every level. All of those remain necessary. All of them must continue. Every available channel must be used, by individuals, by movements, by states and nations, because surrender is not an option. But it is an honest assessment of constraint. Votes can be diluted. Protests can be surveilled. Movements can be infiltrated. Courts can be captured. Alliances can be paralyzed by power imbalance and fear of collapse. That does not make action meaningless, but it does make memory indispensable. Because when power succeeds, it does not only seize territory or institutions. It seizes the story of how it happened. And that is why testimony matters. And yet, we keep speaking, because silence is not neutrality, it is permission. We write, we film, we witness. Not because it will stop the fire, but because the fire must not consume everything. Not truth, not memory, not dignity. This is the reckoning. When we say we are powerless, let us mean only that we do not command armies, but we do command words, and courage, and each other. And words, once spoken and preserved, have a way of outlasting those who tried to erase them. Authoritarian systems understand this instinctively. That is why they target archives. That is why they rewrite textbooks. That is why they ban books, muzzle teachers, intimidate journalists, and flood the public sphere with noise until clarity collapses. They fear memory more than protest, because protests fade, but records endure. And that, in the end, might be what history remembers, or doesn't. It is not for us to control whether this survives, it is only for us to ensure it existed, so that if a future awakens from the ash, it may find something unburned, something that testifies, we were here, and we knew, and we did not surrender the truth. Future readers may judge us differently, and that judgment itself will be shaped by what survives. The flames eventually die, as all fires do. Maybe not because they have been quenched by force or doused by water, but because there is, eventually, nothing left to consume. And when that silence comes, when the last scroll curls into ash, when the marble cracks from heat, when the voices fall quiet, there is nothing left but smoke and memory. This is the chapter that follows catastrophe, the chapter not of resistance but of rebuilding, the chapter the world rarely documents because it does not roar, it whispers. And so begins the quiet rebuild. The fire that destroyed the ancient Library of Alexandria didn't just erase knowledge, it scattered it. Some scrolls survived, copied by monks in far-flung monasteries, preserved in trade routes, and translated in distant lands. The wisdom of entire civilizations was salvaged by the act of transmission, by those who remembered, those who retold, those who wrote it down again. So it is now. In our own age of fire, when digital knowledge can vanish with a keystroke, when narratives are rewritten in real time, when tyrants try to control not only the present but the memory of the past, we too become the scribes of survival. We may not live in the age of mass movements anymore. We live in the age of fragmented witness. Each of us, writer, teacher, artist, friend, carries a thread of the weave. Each of us must write what we saw, what we knew, what we hoped, because that is how memory survives empire. Not through noise, but through repetition, through the everyday act of saying, this happened, I was there, I remember. What comes next, if it comes at all, will not look like the revolutions we remember. This is not a call to grand revolution. The age of banners and barricades has faded. The heroes of yore are buried beneath ash, sand, soil, snow, and in our memory. But the age of new heroes has begun, those ready to stand up to power with voice, the keepers of truth, those who remember and preserve the past and the present with conviction for posterity's future. What follows may be quieter, slower, and harder to recognize, but no less consequential. What endures instead is transmission, memory carried forward until rebuilding becomes possible. This is a call to archive, to etch what we know into memory, to preserve what conscience we have, to resist erasure. Because if the fire comes again, or never leaves, the world will need a record not just of what was lost, but of who refused to forget. Let this be that record. Let these chapters be a lightless lighthouse, a beacon not of salvation, but of signal. So that one day, when the tide shifts and the censers fall and the towers collapse under their own weight, some distant hand may brush away the dust and find in these words the outline of a people who remembered, not perfect, not victorious, but faithful, to truth, to memory, to one another. The fire has taken much, but not everything, not yet. And that is why the work continues, quiet, patient, deliberate, because the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of culture, it was a survival of memory. And that is what we are now. Survivors, memory bearers, keepers of the fire that does not consume. This record is for those who will ask how it happened, and whether anyone tried to stop the forgetting. Let it be written. Let it be remembered so that future heroes can build the next Library of Alexandria from the ashes, its scattered scrolls preserved through our diligence now. Centuries from now, a hand brushes away dust from the archive and finds, in our words, the record of those who did not forget. Let this be the first scroll,